Hey US history class, Mr. Sharon here. Just wanted to go over some of the assignments that you've been given over the past few weeks. I hope you're doing well. I plan on doing some kind of Zoom conference probably middle of the week or end of the week this week. But for now, I'm just going to go over a couple things, mainly the Marshall Plan, the Cold War heats up, and the Korean War notes, which honestly, the Cold War heats up and the Korean War notes, pretty much the same information. But I'll go over those. So first, just want to talk about the Marshall Plan really quick. So before our closure, I gave you some notes on the Cold War, actually on that Friday, I think, before we were dismissed for who knows how long. And as part of those notes, we were talking about the United States and the Soviet Union and how the Cold War was all about this period of tension where we never got into direct conflict against each other, but there were indirect conflicts such as the Korean War and the Vietnam War. It was mainly a struggle for world power. Those were the two countries who were vying to be the dominant world superpower. And in the early years after World War II, we saw President at the time, Harry S. Truman, start up with some policies to try to stop the Soviet Union. Those included the Truman Doctrine, which basically said we would help any countries that were facing any type of internal communist revolution, although we might not have used those words. It was also a policy to really try to prevent the spread of communism, which became known as something called containment, containing communism. One of the ways that we were hoping to help other countries who might face the threat of communism and Soviet influence was through the Marshall Plan. So after World War II, most countries in Europe were broke because that's where the majority of the fighting happened. When war happens within your borders, it's very devastating for your economy. So one of our plans was, let's help other countries before the Soviet Union provides that aid. So it was almost kind of like buying your friends. We had to make sure that we got to everybody before the Soviets did, because we wanted everyone's loyalty to the United States and democracy and to capitalism, not to the Soviet Union and communism, socialism, and dictatorships. So with the worksheet that we did, the Marshall Plan, it broke down some of the aid that we provided. And as you can see, if you look at some of the countries, you got Great Britain, you have France. We gave a lot of aid in terms of industrial goods and food and agricultural goods. We knew that it wasn't really that much of a threat that they would fall to Soviet influence, but with them, they played such a big role in World War II. And we knew that both of them really needed the assistance because of that role in World War II, that we wanted to help them out as two of our biggest allies. When you look at some of these other countries, you have Austria, you have Italy, you have Germany, who were all part of the Axis powers, the bad guys. So we wanted to try to prop these countries up to get the countries who had been the bad guys only a couple of years before. We wanted to make sure they came over to the good side, to the US side of things, to Western Europe, to the countries like France and Great Britain, that they could be countries we could rely on. And also, if you look at this geographically, if you start to get over into Austria, if you look at some of the other countries, maybe Czechoslovakia, well, not Czechoslovakia, scratch that because they had already fallen, but Western Germany, they're very close to that Iron Curtain. And we know that the Iron Curtain divided your capitalist, free, democratic Europe from the Soviet-influenced Europe. So we tried to give a lot of aid to those countries who were right on the border, not only to protect them from Soviet influence, but also to build them up as kind of a buffer zone. So if the Soviets ever decided to launch some kind of invasion of the rest of Europe, at least those first few countries that they'd have to get through would be much stronger and it would slow them down. and it would give the United States, Britain, and France some time to react. So that's pretty much the explanation of the Marshall Plan. It was very important for the U.S. It started this kind of tradition of the United States gains influence and gains power by providing economic aid to the rest of the world. And if you look at how our money's spent today, we spend billions of dollars every year on aid to other countries. And it's pretty controversial. A lot of people don't like it. I hear a lot of U.S. citizens complain that, hey, we're paying taxes and that tax money's going to people from other countries. Why don't we take that money and spend it on ourselves? But if we want to have a key role in world affairs and if we want people on our side, sometimes money is a very effective way to do that. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is the Cold War Heats Up worksheet. We'll just kind of skip over that because all the information that you need to know is in that Korean War PowerPoint, which also talks about the Chinese Civil War. So let's take a look at that. I just want to make sure all this makes sense to you. So if we look at the roots of the conflict, so with the Korean War, it was all about stopping the spread of communism. It was very clear to us after World War II that we couldn't trust the Soviet Union. There was mutual distrust there. We talked about that in the notes on the Friday before the closure. And that was our big aim. After World War II, the Nazis and Italy and Japan, they weren't our enemies anymore. Our new enemies, our big number one enemies would be the communists and the Soviet Union. So, looking at the roots of the conflict, so we had this containment policy, and one of the reasons we had to come up with the Truman Doctrine to help countries that might be overthrown by a communist revolution. The reason we wanted to stop the spread of communism is because we saw what happened in China. So, as you all know today, China is not one of our closest allies. Even though they're a big trading partner, still our relationship is very shaky. I'm sure you've heard a lot of the talk about the coronavirus, the handling by the Chinese government early on, not alerting the rest of the world when it seems like they kind of knew about this. Well, all this tension goes all the way back to the Chinese Civil War, because the people who are running the country now, it's the same exact party that won this Civil War. It's the Communist Party. So let's look at the Civil War. So after World War II, during World War II, we actually sided with the Chinese. They were one of the Allied powers. We don't really talk too much about that specific part of the war, but it's important to keep that in mind. So the government that was in control of China during World War II was led by Chiang Kai-shek. And the political party that ruled the country was called the Nationalists. So they were on our side. They were fighting mainly against Japan. We did provide money and aid. Obviously, most of our fighting against Japan was focused on those Pacific Islands. We didn't really have too much of a chance to get into China itself to do a whole heck of a lot of fighting because we were too preoccupied with getting a lot of our own territory back. But it's important to know that China was an ally. Well, just like what happened in World War I with Russia, because China was so preoccupied, their government was so preoccupied in fighting in this world war, you had this revolutionary movement, another communist movement, these lower working class people who saw the Chinese government as someone who was trying to prop up the rich and create wealth inequality. Well, they wanted to take over the country by a violent uprising, which is how the only way communism has ever happened is through violent revolution. So the leader of this revolution that pops up right at the tail end of World War II is this guy Mao Zedong, who is going to end up being the leader of China for many years, all the way until the 1970s. And it's very apparent right away that this Soviet-US split is going to happen because as of 1945, we're talking the last year of World War II, already we start to see the US on one side of things and the Soviet Union on the other side. So the United States gave $2 billion to the nationalist government in China to try to help them keep control of the country and prevent a communist overthrow. The Soviet Union gave weapons and I believe military assistance in terms of soldiers to actually help fight. The result, well, it wasn't good for us because our allies in China, the most populous nation in the world, end up losing to communists. That's the last thing we wanted to see happen. The old government of China fled, and they went to an island called, well, what we refer to today as Taiwan. And from Taiwan, this government still rules. And to some extent, they still say they are the rightful China. And the communists say they are the rightful China. But I mean, let's be honest here. The communists won the Civil War. They drove out the old Chinese government. They control China now. They control 1.3 billion people. The population of Taiwan, I'm not sure exactly. I mean, it's significantly less than mainland China. After a while, you just kind of have to admit, if you're the United States and the rest of the world, that the communists are in control of China. And this government that fled to this island is not really in control of things anymore. So the United States kept this policy for about 30 years where we did not recognize the Chinese communists as the rightful rulers of China. We only had a relationship with what we call Taiwan today, that island. Eventually, we said we need to open up a relationship with China, the communist one. It's the most populous country in the world, and we're really doing ourselves a disservice if we're cutting off all those people from U.S. influence. So Truman takes a lot of criticism for this, for not containing communism. And the United States citizens start to fear this communist movement is going to go worldwide. And the Chinese Civil War is really important because it's one of the main reasons that we go full-fledged into the Korean War. Especially with Truman, because after all that criticism he took in China, he didn't want to see Korea turn into another China. So let's take a look at the Korean War. Some things you need to know about Korea. The Korean Peninsula that you see on the map there, that was under Japanese control, dating all the way back before the years of World War II. Once World War II ended, Japanese rule of Korea ended, and Korea was on the track to become its own independent country. One country. No North, no South, just one united Korea. In order to help rebuild in that area, in the north, the Soviets took control of some military occupation to make sure the Japanese were completely out of there, to help the north rebuild. It was war-torn at the time, and the United States became the main leader in the south. Well, this is very similar to when we talked about Germany and German reunification and the Berlin airlift. After a while, the United States said, all right, our work here is done. We're ready to let the Koreans go back to being their own country, their own people. We don't need to stay here with our military. They got a new government. Let's move this on. So the United States cut our armed forces in South Korea. And as soon as we did that, the Soviets armed the North Koreans, who were apparently at this point all communist thinking because of that Soviet influence in the North, and also for the fact that they bordered China, so that communist influence was leaking over into North Korea. So the Soviets started a war pretty much. They supported this invasion of the South as soon as the United States dropped our guard, and that's when the war began in June 1950. What ended up happening was it was the South Korea and the United States with support from the United Nations. So this would be the first big test for our new peacekeeping group, the UN, to see if this would be any more effective than the League of Nations had been. Obviously, the League of Nations being the peacekeeping group that failed to stop World War II. And on the other side of things, we saw the people of North Korea, and eventually the Chinese jumped in as well, fresh off their victory in the Chinese Civil War where the communists took over. And the Soviets would mainly support this with weapons and money. try to keep the war going. The Soviet goal here was to create one communist Korean peninsula. They wanted the U.S. completely out, and they wanted just one communist dictatorship ruling the whole thing. So just a little recap of some of the events that happened. In 1950, things got so bad that North Korea actually captured Seoul, the South Korean capital. You know, it's never a good thing when the capital gets captured. The United States actually had that happen to us once in the War of 1812. The British captured Washington, D.C., burnt down the White House, almost captured the president. And that was a pretty close moment for us to downfall. So this could have ended very bad with one united communist Korea. But fortunately, the UN, mainly led by the United States, because as you can see, more than 90% of the soldiers who fought were U.S. soldiers, when you don't count in all the South Koreans who helped fight for themselves. But there was a very quick reaction by the UN and the U.S., and a lot of nations sent a lot of soldiers. Douglas MacArthur comes back to command. He was the guy who was in charge of U.S. forces in the war against Japan in the Pacific. He was very successful in that. For every 9 Japanese soldiers who died fighting against the U.S. in World War II, only 1 U.S. soldier died. A lot of people credit MacArthur and his strategy for those statistics. So this was a good guy to have in charge of South Korea in the Korean War. So after the capital gets captured, if you look on the map here, you're going to see a little tiny area down at the bottom right-hand corner of South Korea. That's pretty much all that was left for South Korea. The North, the communists had taken over everything else at one point in 1950. Fortunately, under MacArthur's leadership, South Korea, the U.S., the UN are able to push the North almost back to the North Korean border. You'll see a dotted line in the map there. So this went back and forth a couple times, where it looked like at one point you would have one united communist Korea, and then at one point it looked like it was going to be one united democratic Korea, but neither of those ended up happening. Once it looked like the communists were on the ropes, they would have been, except the Chinese decided to join in. They sent 300,000 soldiers in November of 1950 to join North Korea. And once again, this is one of the reasons why even still to this day, even though we have a relationship with China, things are still very tense, because it wasn't all that long ago where U.S. soldiers fought against Chinese soldiers. In January 1951, we had been pushed back again out of North Korean territory. I got this little infographic here. So there was some tension building between MacArthur and Truman. MacArthur was one of these guys who liked to do things his way. He didn't always listen to everybody else. You could see this dating all the way back to the Bonus Army. You might remember right after the Great Depression had started, there were a lot of soldiers, World War I veterans, who had stormed the White House and protested on the White House lawn. They wanted some bonuses early that they were guaranteed for their service in World War I. And we talked about how the military came down especially harsh on these veterans who were protesting. They set their camps on fire. They set off tear gas. One baby actually died as a result of the military's reaction. Well, the guy who was in charge of all that was actually Douglas MacArthur years before. And then he goes on to be the main commander of U.S. troops in the Pacific. And then once again, he's the leader in the Korean War. Well, him and Truman started to butt heads. So the main reason they butted heads is because Truman had this idea. MacArthur had this idea that because the Chinese got involved, here was an opportunity to attack China and to drive the communists out of China. Let's extend this war not just into Korea, but let's extend it into China and just put an end to communism for good. Obviously, with the exception of the Soviet Union, we weren't ready to take them on yet. So MacArthur's plan was to drop nuclear bombs on roughly 26 locations across China. Some estimates are that if this plan actually went through, we would have killed like 500 million Chinese. So in all of World War II, about 80 million people died. Under MacArthur's plan, about 500 million Chinese would have died. So Truman didn't like this idea. At this point in history, we're not the only ones with nuclear weapons anymore. The Soviet Union has them. And we know, or at least Truman knew, that a nuclear attack against China was probably going to cause a nuclear retaliation strike by the Soviets against the United States. So this would have been World War III. Hundreds of millions, if not billions of people would have died in nuclear war. It could have been the end of everything. So Truman tried to rein in MacArthur. MacArthur didn't want to listen to Truman. MacArthur tried to go through with the plan anyway. And Truman took quick action and got MacArthur out of there before he could go firing off a bunch of nukes. Moving on. So that's pretty much a conflict. Although we say it was 1950 to 1953, most of the fighting took place 1950, 1951. In 1951, the Soviets suggested a ceasefire agreement. Although there was still some fighting, the armistice or the ceasefire didn't actually go through until July 1953. We did see the foundations of peace set in 1951. So the ceasefire agreement, once it was finally agreed to, would create a separate North and South Korea at the existing battle line at the time, which was that 38th parallel you had to define on the worksheet. There would be a demilitarized zone between each side, which meant that soldiers were not supposed to be within a certain distance of the border, although it hasn't worked out that way. The border is very heavily militarized. There's a bunch of mines. It's a very tense situation, even to this day. There would be an exchange of all prisoners. And when you look at what this really cost the United States, we lost 54,000 soldiers, which is a pretty big toll. It's one of the highest losses. In terms of total losses in U.S. history, it's one of our worst wars, 54,000 lives fighting in it. And it cost us $67 billion at the time, which if you adjust that to today's value of money would be significantly higher. And what you see right there is the North Korean border. As long as you watch that video that I asked you to watch and write the 2 paragraphs on Life in North Korea, they went over some of this. They showed you what the situation is like at the border. We know that to this day, tension is really bad between the U.S. and North Korea. North Korea pretty much kind of keeps to themselves. They have few friends today, except for China, really, is their main ally. North Korea likes to threaten the rest of the world. As of the 2000s, they did invent nuclear weapons. They have atomic bombs. They claim that they invented a hydrogen bomb, which is a much more powerful version of an atomic bomb. We're still not exactly sure of their nuclear capabilities. They do underground tests. We know that President Trump was the first U.S. president to ever sit and meet with a leader of North Korea, trying to create some kind of peace, because there's been a lot of talk about war, especially over the last 10, 15 years between North Korea, the United States, South Korea. A lot of our allies feel threatened. I know Japan is also another country that feels very threatened by North Korea being right there in close proximity. What's going on right now? Well, from what I'm hearing, during this whole coronavirus crisis, North Korea is doing a bunch of missile launches. They're not actually launching them at anybody. It's missile tests. But every time they start to ramp up these missile tests, the rest of the world views it as a threat. They have said in the past that they would use missiles against their enemies, and that's why they want nuclear weapons. Despite Donald Trump's efforts to try to kind of talk them down from their nuclear program, we know that they're probably still working on a nuclear program to some extent, despite what they're telling us. So that's it. If you have any questions, please reach out to me, and I hope you all have a great day.